Right, it is now 12 o'clock, so we're going to dive straight in. Good morning, and thank you very much for joining us for this fifth live webinar in our 12-part series. Today we're looking at the dual impact of two pieces of UK legislation which are now going to be impacting on vetting and screening. One is around the need to prevent sexual harassment, and the other is to address the ever-increasing amount of fraud committed within the workplace. And today I'm delighted to be joined by a highly experienced and independent background screening consultant, my good friend Anton Watson, and between us we have over 40 years of dedicated background screening experience, and we've worked for some of the biggest background checking companies and some of the largest organizations in the world. But before we get into the introductions, let's just quickly run through what we're going to be covering in today's session. As always, we'll be starting with a bit of background around both pieces of legislation and the implementation of the two acts as well, and providing a much needed overview of what's changing before we dive into a discussion around some of the key points. We're going to be talking about what the changes mean to individuals, to employers, and indeed to screening teams as well, and we'll be providing guidance on understanding the timelines and how to prepare and stay compliant. Ultimately, today's webinar is all about addressing the need for preventing the single most common type of crime, which is fraud, and making safer and more inclusive working environments by preventing harassment, specifically sexual harassment in the workplace. We're going to just launch a quick poll. So it's just about ECCTA and Worker Protection Act and how familiar you are with these two pieces of recent legislation. So we'll be able to see your responses as they come through. So far, nobody is very familiar with the Act, so that explains why you are with us today. Let's introduce Anton. Anton began his career in recruitment, learning and development, and in HR. And he worked across the whole of the Asia Pacific region before moving to London in the noughties to work for control risk screening. And after 5 successful years, the poacher turned gamekeeper when he joined Bank of America Merrill Lynch to manage their background checking and client due diligence program. And he was there for almost a dozen years. And with extensive experience in background checking and HR, Anton really has gained some unique insight into creating successful background check programs and mitigating hiring and insider risks. So as Director of Background Check Advisory, Anton now provides expertise on background checking, products, policies, and processes to enhance screening practices across multiple industries. Anton, thank you ever so much for joining. It's great to see you. Thanks for agreeing to join me today, and we very much look forward to hearing from you.
You're welcome. Thanks, David. I'm looking forward to the conversation.
Super. So what we're talking about first today is all about protecting and preventing harassment, especially sexual harassment in the workplace. We really want to convey the importance for employers to take responsibility for sincerely trying to prevent harassment from occurring. Of course, this is very topical this week in particular due to the ongoing scandal surrounding a certain presenter of BBC's MasterChef. The Worker Protection Act actually came into force on October the 1st, 2024. Why? Because according to a survey, and it shames me deeply as a man to say this, but an average of 6 out of 10 women surveyed, and that's out of over 11,000 respondents, admitted that they had experienced sexual harassment in the workplace. And that figure actually rose to 70% for both disabled women and LGBT workers. Those are truly horrific statistics. So no wonder there was this introduction of the Worker Protection Act. Delighted to see it introduced, and now all the emphasis is on organisations to take proactive steps to prevent further workplace sexual harassment occurring. This includes mandating that all employees or employers implement preventative policies and preventative practices too. So the key requirements of WPA, and it introduces several key provisions, but firstly it imposes a legal duty on employers to prevent sexual harassment. And this includes provisions for protection involving interactions with third parties too. This could include customers, contractors, suppliers as well. So it's not just the direct workforce. Now, the Worker Protection Act helps simplify the application process for reporting incidents as well. Another horrific statistic is that research revealed that 4 out of 5 incidences of sexual harassment actually go unreported. So as a result, the WPA now mandates that employers establish clear and accessible reporting channels for victims. And this includes digital platforms platforms for anonymous reporting, which is of course crucial, dedicated HR contacts, hotlines, and online portals. Now, employers are required to take reasonable steps to protect employees, which is clearly where background checks come into play as the first line of defense. And it's really important to note that victims receive 25% more in terms of compensation from tribunals if preventative steps were deemed not to have been taken by the employer. So really, I don't think 25% is enough, but it really does demonstrate how the financial penalties could impact organisations if you do not take this matter seriously. Now, the impact on HR and staff vetting, I'm sure we're speaking to a lot of people in HR and compliance today, and really from an HR standpoint, employers need to develop policies, if they haven't done so already, to train managers and really create a safe environment for employees to report incidents. Whether that's the victim or a witness of abuse, these mechanisms and systems have to be in place. Now, we of course urge all employers to adopt enhanced screening processes with modern background checks and tools, because we firmly believe that the traditional checks are no longer fit for purpose when undertaken on their own. But crucially, we believe strongly that ongoing monitoring, and by that I mean regular rechecks, vetting of existing staff, rescreening basically, is needed to mitigate the risk of harassment in the workplace. A lot of information there, but as you know, this is about two acts, not just the one. The WPA already came into force this year, but the Economic Crime and Corporate Transparency Act, quite a mouthful, so I'll refer to it as ECCTA from here on in. This is basically in response to fraud, which is still increasing and heading towards half of all crimes that are reported to police in the UK on an annual basis. It's a transformative law that's aimed at preventing fraud and enhancing corporate transparency. We're going to look at the background of ECCTA, its key provisions, and crucially, of course, its impact on staff vetting. So the ECCTA is a new law aimed at preventing fraud, which is reportedly increased by 1,400% over the last 10 years alone. It's an incredible statistic, but £2.3 billion worth of fraud reported in the UK in 2023 alone. So the reforms under ECCTA include expanding companies' house powers, very, very much needed, I must admit, having worked with Companies House for many years. Some of these measures are already in place, and they're all around strengthening identity verification. You'll often see multiple directors listed under Companies House. That's one of the things that needs to be addressed, because it prevents banned and barred directors from applying again, registering as a director for other organisations and perpetrating further fraud. So strengthening identity verification and also introducing unlimited penalties for failing to prevent fraud. Now, this actually kicks in September the 1st, 2025 now. It's been delayed. It was due to take effect around about now, Q4 2024, but it has been pushed back to next September. Now, one of the key aspects of ECCTA is that it introduces 6 key principles rather than prescriptive procedures. So it's quite a lot to get your head around when first reading ECCTA and what it actually meant. But fortunately, a new guidance document was issued just a couple of weeks ago, which really puts some meat on the bones and gives employers a lot of handy advice and guidance. But the principles are designed to guide companies in implementing effective anti-fraud measures. And those 6 key principles include top-level commitment, so real investment from the C-suite, risk assessment, really understanding where employers sit, organisations sit in terms of fraud risk at the moment, implementing proportionate risk-based prevention measures, and that can cover a multitude of things, as can due diligence, both of which really impact on vetting and screening, communication across the business and externally as well, and monitoring and review of the effectiveness of fraud prevention measures. Now, these 6 principles are designed to ensure companies take a comprehensive and proactive approach to preventing fraud rather than responding to events that occur. Additionally, as I mentioned, to bring these key principles to life, a new guidance was released just a couple of weeks ago by the government. There's a link to it later on in the webinar, and I would recommend you take a look at this. But for me, the key point is that it highlighted vetting as being the #1 defense in preventing fraud, which is why Anton and I and all of us here at EBC Global are taking the ECCTA so seriously. So if we look into the key provisions, first and foremost, the Act introduces a new failure to prevent fraud offence for employers. As you can see, this includes various forms of fraudulent activities listed on the slide, such as fraudulent or insider trading, fraud by false representation, participating in fraudulent business, false accounting, and obtaining services dishonestly. So it's quite a broad brush there, but they're all crimes that can and are perpetrated by internal staff, which is why vetting is so crucial. Bear in mind that there are regional differences in in the interpretation of fraud in Northern Ireland and Scotland. There's quite a broad brush there, but there are specific implications in other devolved nations. I must stress, though, that the Act isn't limited to staff. It also applies to what they deem or term associated persons. And these are defined as employees, agents, subsidiaries, and external consultants who perform services for or on behalf of the organisation. And one of the factors that we've already seen implemented was the introduction of enhanced ID verifications for company directors. This all increases transparency in company ownership. I've touched on that a moment ago, but there are an awful lot of changes going on at Companies House at the moment, and there'll be implementation of more provisions of ECCTA rolling out over the coming months and indeed years. As you can see by the first bullet, ECCTA is started in 2023 and is due to be completely implemented by 2027. Now, as I mentioned, the penalties for the offence of failure to prevent fraud are unlimited, so emphasising the seriousness of compliance with the Act. Now, I just want to touch on the impact of ECCTA on background checks. We'll go into a lot more detail here, but it really does necessitate enhanced screening processes and identity verification for all. It also introduces enhanced due diligence requirements, including those checks on associated persons that I mentioned a moment ago, and transparency around vetting for audits and for investigations is emphasised in the guidance, something again we'll be pushing home very shortly. There's a clear need for ongoing vetting and continuous monitoring of risk. Something you'll hear me say a lot is that pre-employment screening as a concept is dead or dying. It really has to be an ongoing focus on continuing checks, measures, vetting, rescreening, top-up checks, call it what you like. If you just do one-time checks on new hires, you really are leaving yourself wide open to all sorts of insider risks. So adherence to and/or adoption of each of these measures is crucial in ensuring that companies can effectively prevent fraud and comply with the new legislation. A couple of final points that I really want to make before we move on, though, is that the failure to prevent fraud offence comes into place in September, and it will only be applied at that stage to large organisations, but not necessarily those that are just in the UK either. The penalties can also apply to organisations that are based outside of the UK. This came somewhat as a surprise to me, but the UK's framework for corporate criminal liability already has extraterritorial reach, and that means that the failure to prevent fraud offence can apply to organisations overseas if a relevant event related to the fraud occurs in the UK, whether that's by an employee or indeed by an associated person, which would be the case in most scenarios of fraud from overseas. So quite a lot to take in there. Let's just take a break from listening to me for a moment. I'll turn this back over to you and launch poll number 2 to see how prepared you feel that you are for the new legislation based on what you've just heard. Great to see that everybody has at least heard of these new pieces of legislation, the new acts. Of course, you wouldn't be here had you not done so. Right, in the interest of time, we're going to jump straight into the next bits. Thanks for your participation. But now I'm going to invite Anton to talk about the impact on background screening. And that's regardless of whether these are in-house vetting teams or indeed outsourced screening service providers. So Anton, over to you.
Thanks, David. Appreciate it. Well, there's certainly a lot of information there, as you said, to digest, right, and to unpack. So I think this is a really useful slide to sort of highlight if you're running a background check program, whether it be internally, externally, with partners, what do you need to focus on? And I think we've got 3 things on the slide here. The first is as you put it, the adaptation or the adoption of new products or services. So they are recommending that there is implementation of further background checks to mitigate fraud and to protect people from things like sexual harassment in the workplace. There's also a recommendation to extend it to third-party screening programs. So that is interesting and something that people will want to take an interest in, I think, and to identify in general within their organization how they can identify, these potential risk factors. There is going to be a need, again, on the slide in the middle here, for there to be a clear guidance on these changes to these acts and people being able to assist people with rescreening that could be happening or with updates to policies as well. There's also a clear indication from what you're talking about, David, about there being updated screening or vetting policies to make sure that they are adhering to these legislation changes and obviously changes across the industry in relation to fraud levels and all of that sort of stuff. So I think there's quite a lot to unpack there, but I think this is a good slide of sort of summarizing from a background screening perspective, what would you need to focus on? David, maybe we also jump to the next slide, because I think that's probably a nice follow on from this. What are the combined impact to screening? There's an interesting point made on this slide down the bottom here, where we're saying there is the demise of pre-employment screening. And I think that's probably the first point to make here, is with these changes to the Act, they're really recommending that it is vetting that is conducted during the life cycle of someone that works for your organization. They're also recommending that there's an inclusion of more comprehensive background checks. So we also have something on the screen here which talks about enhanced due diligence. And if you want to, again, take it specifically back to your own background check programs, then the first question you want to be asking is, how are you doing your identity verification? Is it robust? Is it in line with new industry standards, which is digital identity? And are you also aware of the newer background checks that are available in the market, such as social media checks and such as immediate and instant employment verifications that help you mitigate fraud better? So I think that the recommendation with enhanced due diligence is really about staying informed with what is available and what will help you to adhere to these new guidelines and also ultimately mitigate fraud. So that takes you to the middle point you have on the slide, David, which is making sure that you have got the right policies in place. And we're not just talking about background check policies. Do you have anti-harassment policies in place? And do they also correlate to your existing background check programs? So if you have all of that, that's great. But if people are not aware of those policies, or they don't understand why you are doing all of this new or enhanced background checking, then that's also an area that you could focus on. So these two slides are probably just a good wrap up, David, of what you've sort of covered with us and how we can sort of make sure that we're applying it specifically to someone's background check program or policy.
Exactly that. Thank you so much, Anton. That's some great advice and insight there. I'm sure you've got questions forming as I speak, so let's just gauge where potential worries might be as I launch this next poll. So we're looking at your concerns regarding the implementation of the new acts. Fantastic. Got a good few answers coming there, and understanding the new legislation is, as expected, coming out on top, followed by introducing a rescreening or ongoing vetting program, which is great to hear. Well, I say it's great to hear. These are concerns that you're raising, so maybe you don't have one in place at the moment, or maybe you've got concerns about how to actually apply that. Now, this is probably a good point to remind you that we've got a Q&A tab. Drop questions in there at any point and we can pick those up at the end of the session. So got a new approach here for these webinars, and we want to turn the topic into a discussion rather than just a slideshow. So Anton, when it comes to adapting to a modern era of background checking, for you, what are the best tools and products to help businesses prepare to prevent fraud and sexual harassment, or all harassment, in the workplace?
Sure. I think the first one to mention, because we've already mentioned it, is obviously robust ID checks. So I think you need to make sure that you know who you are hiring. I think that's really critical, and I think you need to make sure that you are doing it with the most advanced technology available. So it must be probably digital identity. And then look, there's a really broad range that can help you prevent fraud and harassment in the marketplace. Social media, though, is one that comes to mind to prevent harassment, because you can begin to look at someone's online footprint, and sometimes that is an indicator of what could possibly be adverse behavior, and that is certainly becoming more common. But there's also very simple things like doing a very basic resume check against the background check form to make sure that the person you're hiring is applying for a job with integrity. There's also other things which are in the market now, which is instant employment verification. So instead of just taking a reference up on someone, you're also validating that you're going right to the source with HMRC or payroll or open data. So I think there's a suite there of stuff that's available, but I think the more important point is that you understand what background check products are available in the market, and that you're able to take a view of what you think would be appropriate for your organization.
Anton, you made a great point there about the instant employment verifications, this new wave of verification products that are currently used to complement, I'd say, rather than replace at this stage traditional referencing. But from your perspective, why are traditional references no longer featured so heavily, or perhaps why are they not so effective today as they have been in recent years?
Yeah, I mean, sadly, I'd have to say, because you really can't trust the integrity of a lot of those references anymore. I mean, I could show you very easily now how to purchase a reference online from a range of reference houses, which you would never know were fake. And they go beyond just issuing the reference. They set up websites, they set up email domains. So you've got to look beyond the reference, and you need to look at source information. So it's just, I think these new tools are helping to mitigate fraud a little bit better. They're helping you to understand, okay, Anton did work at that organization for the last 5 years. And we know that there is taxation records, perhaps open banking, and perhaps payroll. And then you can also get a feeling for his skills through the reference. But it's unfortunately the way that the world is changing, you're beginning to not be able to rely on traditional referencing because you cannot trust where that information is coming from as much as you once could anyway.
So you couldn't agree more. I tell you what, Anton, one of the biggest bugbears that talent acquisition professionals, recruiters, organizations face is the amount of time it takes to complete a background screening. You've mentioned a number of new checks that we recommend adding into a background screening policy, but will adding these checks not make turnaround times even longer for vetting and screening?
I think this is where there's a positive change, really. Once upon a time, I would have said yes to that question, but now I would actually say no because of the advancements in technology and some of the checks we're talking about here. They are quicker and they're more reliable. So no, I don't necessarily think it needs to take longer, but I do think what you also want to do at the same time is you want to do a risk-based analysis of the background checks that you're conducting. And you need to make sure that they're effective for your organization, they make sense to the risks that are being posed to your organization, and they're in line with, for example, the acts that you're talking about today. You need to probably work with your background check provider like EBC Global or independent advisors that can probably help you to understand if what you're doing makes sense in a timely way.
There's one thing I really want to jump on, and that is kind of COVID introduced a new dynamic to a lot of employers where they started thinking about onboarding workers before all of the background checks would be completed, like a two-phased or multi-phased approach. Is this something that you've seen continue as a trend since the start of the pandemic, or are we now back to the wait until all the checks are completed before onboarding staff now?
No, I think it's very common now that you would see a tiered approach, or what we used to call pairs 1 and pairs 2, so pre-employment screening 1 and pre-employment screening 2. That's very common, and it makes a lot of sense because you're able to identify risks that you want to mitigate before the person starts working for your organization, and you can assess whether you can accept some of the risks or the background checks remaining while they join you. Typically, they'd be done within the first 30 days. Implementing strategies like that will make your program much more time effective, but at the same time, it still mitigates a good level of risk.
Absolutely. Subject to satisfactory background checks. I love that catch-all at the end of every consent form. So thanks for that. We're just going to jump into the need for information and guidance. You know, we're talking about a lot of new concepts, a lot of new practices. So what upskilling is going to be required, and where can guidance be found when it comes to these new acts and the provisions for vetting and screening?
I think this webinar today is great, Dave, because that's the first thing. You want to make sure that you're working with the right background check provider who should be giving you advice in these areas, right? And I know that you're going to provide some links to people to look at. You need to read and understand the act. You could work with independent advisors. Also speak to other organizations within your industry or peers, what their take on it is and what they may be doing. I think that's what a lot of companies fail to do. They try to tackle changes in legislation or industry on their own, when very simply you could speak to your nearest competitor or your people in your industry, and you could find out how other people are already doing these changes. There are certainly industry best practices, and they can be shared quite easily if you have the right knowledge and contact.
Absolutely. I tell you what, something that's really begun to grate my gears is this whole concept about how much reliance can be placed on artificial intelligence, particularly when it comes to implementation of new acts, new laws, new legislation. You know, where is AI getting this advice from? Because I've seen a lot of nonsense online from various sources. So can HR rely wholly on AI to provide all the answers, to create all the necessary policies and screening program content?
I mean, the simple answer to that is no. But there is certainly a place for AI in background checking, and it's certainly beginning to be used a lot in background checking. I think where it cannot and shouldn't be used is the creation wholly of your policies or the assessment of background check results. That is where expertise needs to come in and knowledge and training needs to come in. So yeah, I think there's certainly a place for it, and I'm seeing it used in some really great ways across the industry. You should never rely on it fully and wholly, and particularly not with the sort of subjects that we're talking about today.
Great stuff. Again, couldn't agree more. I really wanted to take the opportunity of having you with us today to ask you about the major challenges that your customers are experiencing in general when it comes to background screening, and how do you help overcome them?
That's a good question. The most logical one is always the time it takes to complete background checks and the costs, and making sure that people understand the way the program works or how it should work. Having effective policies in place is another big one. We often find that people have background check policies in place that they perhaps don't understand a lot of what's in their background check policy or why it's in their policy, or they've not looked at them for many years. Or again, they have not considered how other people do it in their industry or what the general best practices are. So there's a lot there, but I think the main things would probably be, as I mentioned, turnaround time and the knowledge and effective creation of policies and managing of a program.
So does that mean there's very much an appetite for change, or is there still the traditional reluctance to change?
I think it depends a little bit on industry, a little bit, David. Some industries are more advanced than others, but there's certainly beginning to be a sea change. And I think that the reason there is a sea change is that unfortunately the risks are continuing to evolve. You can bypass most traditional background check programs now with relative ease. And I think organizations are beginning to realize that. And then they eventually take that right back to their policy. And that begins to be where they start looking at everything we're talking about.
Wonderful. Jumping on to compliance and monitoring now. So should organizations look at addressing vetting requirements for WPA and ECCTA together, or would you advise that they separate the two?
I think you should look at them together. Again, it's not just these acts that you should be looking at. The general message here from the update to these acts is that you need to have a background check program that mitigates risk and combats fraud and safeguards your workforce, your employees. That's looking at everything. That's your whole policy. You don't need to look at these apps. You need to look at whole picture for your organization. And I think you should do that really with your background check provider. They should be an advisor to help you with that. And obviously, if you need advice, there's obviously people like myself in the industry that can give you advice about how it should and is typically done across the industry.
Absolutely. And I think that leads nicely into the next question regarding auditing. Obviously, the best way to identify gaps and risk is through audits. So how important are those regular audits and policy reviews when it comes to vetting and screening in general, regardless of the new acts?
I think they're really important. And I think we're sort of mentioning that across our discussion today. If you have a background check policy, that should be looked at least annually. Otherwise, it will be out of date. And one of the most important areas that you should look at is what I would call your adjudication guidelines or your decision guidelines. Because if you're spending all this time and money conducting all of these background checks, but you're not having a team of people that understand how to review the background check results and make effective hiring decisions, then you certainly won't be mitigating as much risk as you think you are. And you also may not be adhering to these acts that we're talking about today. It's a really critical stage that unfortunately a lot of organizations don't do. They'll put a policy in place and then it's left there for a few years and it's only picked up again when something goes wrong. So it's something that is really quite important.
Super. In the interest of time, I'm going to jump into this next slide about what good looks like. How can you get to the situation where you've got a comprehensive end-to-end screening program?
If you were speaking to me, for example, as an advisor in the industry, this is how I would tell you to even look at what we're talking about today. Look at the 4 building blocks of a successful background check program. And the first one is product. If you don't understand or know the background check products that are available to you, then that's the very first step you want to take. Make sure you know the risks that they're designed to mitigate and you understand how they work. Once you've done that, you can then look at, for example, the acts that you're talking about today and where you might need to update or amend your policy and what background check products you might want to include in that policy. And again, make sure you keep it updated and make sure that people within your organization and your background check vendor understand what your policy is. So once you've done that, then you can move into your process. So understand how to do background checks in a timely manner, because again, we're talking about that today, and how to make sure that it's streamlined and that it works for your organization. And again, once you've done that, you can move to the last building block, which we like to talk about is your background check provider. So if you've got a solid understanding of product, you know your policy is effective, you know you've designed a process that works well for you, then you can engage a background check provider that should complement what you've already designed. And again, as we've said, be an advisor to you with things that we're talking about today. So I think those 4 key steps for me, David, in general, but also specifically what we're talking about today.
Terrific. Thanks, Anton. Back to the discussion around the future of vetting and screening now when it comes to risk mitigation. What does the future of vetting and screening look like in your opinion and based on your experience as a consultant in the background screening space, Anton?
Look, I think it's going to continue to evolve and change. Background checking or background vetting is not going away. These changes, again, are highlighting the fact that it's continually being enhanced, and I think there's always going to be work to do. I think you're going to see AI helping quite a lot, but I think we must remember that AI should not be taking over the knowledge and expertise that you would have built up already within your organization. There's going to be a change from pre-employment screening to vetting, and that's already happening. You need to be looking at the life cycle of when someone is working with you. So I think that's really, really important. And there's also going to be a change to background check providers that are supplying the industry. You're going to find the traditional background check providers, you're going to find tech providers, platform providers, the likes of Confirm, Misto. There's a lot of change in the supplier market as well. So I think that's all positive. Everybody is trying to make sure that we continue to combat fraud and that technology helps people do that faster and more cost effective. So there's a lot of positivity there. But at the same time, as much as all of that leaps forward, fraudsters are also developing tools and AI to help them bypass traditional background check programs. The message there is you just need to stay on top of things and not look at these policies and programs once a year. You must sort of have it on your radar.
Amazing, thank you. So we're now going to talk a little bit about best practice versus bad practice. For me, what bad looks like in 25 are, of course, as we've touched on, outdated screening policies and programs, those that haven't been looked at for years or decades in some cases, a reliance on document collection for references and credentials, that's professional, academic and employment credentials there, slow turnaround times, there's no real excuse for those outside of most areas of your background check programs, poor technology resulting in poor candidate experience. I think that's one of the big drivers in employers and organizations looking to make changes in this space. Technology is, of course, key. Lack of customer service and candidate support. We hear a lot about that as being, big drivers for the need to change. Non-compliance and lack of investment in vetting. I continue to fear that at the highest level, vetting isn't taken seriously as it should do. And hopefully the introduction of these new acts is really going to change the focus. Please push it up the flagpole to the very top to make sure that they are aware of what's going on. And any program that is deficient in terms of rescreening or ongoing vetting, of course, that for me is what really bad looks like. What about you, Anton? What really stands out?
Yeah, I think probably the thing that stands out for me is probably your top one, which is outdated screening policies and programs. Again, that's kind of the message today is if you want to adhere to these changes, that's how you would probably go about doing that.
Hard to argue with that at all. It's a good way of encompassing everything. So now on a slide where we just want to talk about a few cases where screening can go wrong. There was a recent case where a fraudster, a nurse, was sentenced to 5 years in prison. It was great to see a strong sentence for this individual, and it was purely around CV lies, fabrications, falsification of references, etc. She'd completely fabricated her history, and she was sentenced for obtaining, it's no longer called obtaining pecuniary advantage by deception, but essentially that her rewards of crime was her salary that she otherwise wouldn't have achieved. And I think it really sets a precedent for the courts and for the whole of the justice system to ensure that fraudsters, even when it comes to CV lies, are penalised appropriately. The next one relates to poor screening policy. This is where Dean Carolser, a South African paedophile who had been convicted overseas, ended up getting a job in the UK at Butlins as a children's lifeguard, where he worked for almost a year. This is purely because Butlins failed to have international checks included in their screening policy as one of many gaps that they had, but that's the big one that allowed this individual to put children at risk. And of course, any modern or any good modern background checking program involving social media and adverse internet checks would have identified this person. He was a very high profile paedophile in both South Africa and in Australia, where he had previously been worked and convicted. And then finally, over recent weeks, hopefully you'll all have been aware of the furore around Rachel Reeves, her job as Chancellor. She had all sorts of fabrications and, again, CV lies in her CV, both online, well, particularly online. You could see on LinkedIn profile that she'd changed her employment history, the employer, and her position once she was called out as having lied about how long she had worked and where she had worked and in what capacity. So this one, I think, will roll and roll it, although it's interesting to see that the politicians have already fallen on their sword in recent days for criminal record, but similar scenarios. So again, will be interesting to see what precedent comes out of this. One final slide I really wanted to do is just to highlight how quick or slow the various type of background checks take and the cost implications as well. So there's a whole raft of green keyed checks that are really cost efficient and very, very fast or instant in most cases. Then you've got checks like social media checks, media and adverse internet checks, which cost a little bit more, take maybe 1 to 3 days rather than being instant, but really start to add a lot more value to a background screening program. Criminal record checks probably fall into that category as well, apart from those enhanced DBS checks, which now have shot through the roof in terms of costs with the new DBS fees. And then it's really only the traditional employment referencing, the academic and professional qualification checks, and indeed some international background checks where you're looking at, 1 to 2 weeks. Maybe some checks will expand, and of course in the financial services sector, those regulated references can indeed take a number of weeks, 6 weeks to be returned. And then of course enhanced due diligence checks, which are really only available for certain roles, can cost an awful lot of money and take a long time, but really would be advised for some of the most senior roles. Just want to introduce the resources. There's some links in the guidance, so we'll wrap this up into a nice blog including these links. Video will also be available on YouTube, so please feel free to like and share in the traditional manner. There were a few questions that have come through which I'd love to just pick. The first one being, we don't currently do any rescreening. How common is rescreening now in the UK? Just in a sentence or two, Anton.
Very common and becoming much more common, and not as difficult to put in place as one would think. I think it's always the thought about rescreening. It's not. We could certainly help people with that if they wanted conversation.
Yeah. Becoming the rule rather than the exception these days. What is the definition of a large organisation in relation to ECCTA? Fantastic question, and sorry if I'm not making that clear. So 2 of 3 requirements have to be met. That is a revenue of over £36 million a year, or a balance sheet of around 26 million a year. It might be 18, bear with. And finally, the third one is organisations employing over 250 people. But what they do say is, whilst the penalties will only apply to these large organisations, all organisations should be taking fraud prevention seriously and following best practice guidance. There was one more question around social media checks, whether or not they're legal in the UK. Yeah, absolutely they're legal. They're mandated in certain sectors, but they are only legal if they're conducted professionally and in the right way. There are all sorts of variables which could put you into the grey area or even into risk. For me, the best way is always to outsource. You can't unsee something that you've already seen if you're a member of staff within an organisation, and all sorts of both conscious and unconscious bias can impact your decision making in social media checks. So best to outsource to a very reputable organisation with high quality social media and adverse internet checks. So those are all the questions we got time for. Today's session is actually a nice segue into the importance of effective background screening policies and what good looks like. And we've got Anton, the ultimate expert, returning to co-host with me again in January. So that's January the 21st at 12 o'clock again. We hope to see you all then. Anton, thank you so much for your help and guidance and all your insight into today's session. Final word from you?
Thanks very much for having me. Been a great conversation and great discussion. I think final word from me is just to make sure that if you're looking at this today and trying to figure out what next steps are, go back and follow the 4 steps that we gave you, which is product, policy, process, and provider, and I think you'll be off on the right direction.
That's amazing. Everybody, thanks ever so much. Keep calm and carry on checking. Goodbye.